My son didn't just ask me to give up my house for his luxury lifestyle. He already forged my signature to steal $50,000 from me. But when he tried to evict me on Thanksgiving, I changed the locks and watched his entire life crumble. If you don't sign the deed by tomorrow, Mom, we're changing the locks on the Long Island house anyway. My son Brandon didn't look at me when he said it. He was busy wiping a spot of grease off his leather jacket. His wife, Vanessa, sat across from him at my dining table, casually swirling her wine. It was Thanksgiving 2025. I was 62, a widow who still worked 40 hours a week at the local library, and I was currently being evicted from the home I bought with my late husband 30 years ago. The house is in my name, Brandon, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked at the turkey carcass on the table, the dirty plates, the mess they expected me to clean. Your father and I paid off the mortgage 5 years before he passed. Vanessa scoffed, setting her glass down with a sharp click. And you're living in the past, Vivian. Brandon needs the equity to secure his franchise loan. You're one person living in 4 bedrooms. It's selfish. We already found a lovely senior apartment complex near Queens. It's got a shuttle bus. I looked at my son, the boy I held through croup, the boy whose college tuition I paid by skipping vacations for a decade. He just nodded, staring at his phone. You have until Friday, Brandon said, standing up. We already talked to the bank about the transition. They left without helping with the dishes. I sat alone in the quiet house, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator. For the past 2 years since Vanessa entered the picture, I had made excuses for Brandon. He was stressed. He was under pressure at work. But looking at the cold, half-eaten food on the table, a hard truth settled in my chest. I had raised a boy who thought my love was a blank check he could cash whenever he ran out of money. And I had allowed him to think that by never saying no. I didn't call a lawyer, mostly because I couldn't afford the retainer on a librarian's salary, but also because this wasn't a legal problem yet. It was a family problem. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office. I wanted to see exactly what Brandon thought he had access to. Morning, Vivian, the clerk, an old friend named Clara, said as she handed me the property file. Looking up the tax assessments. Just doing some long overdue paperwork, Clara, I replied. When I opened the folder, my heart stopped. There was a secondary signature on my home equity line of credit application from 6 months ago. It looked like mine, but the loop on the V was wrong. Brandon had forged my name to take out a $50,000 advance. He hadn't just asked for the house. He had already started taking it. My hands shook. The old Vivian, the mother who wanted peace at all costs, wanted to call him and beg for an explanation. She wanted to believe it was a mistake. But the woman sitting in that cold government building realized something else. If I confronted him now, he would lie. Vanessa would spin a story, and I would end up apologizing for catching them. I copied the documents, put them in my canvas tote bag, and drove back home. On the way, I stopped at the hardware store and bought a heavy-duty deadbolt lock. I didn't change the whole house, just the door to the basement where my husband's old coin collection and my grandmother's silver were kept. I wasn't going to run away, but I wasn't going to leave the vault open either. Why the hell is the basement locked, and why aren't your boxes packed? Brandon was standing on my porch 3 days later, his face red from the November wind. Vanessa was waiting in the car, her engine idling. He didn't come with a greeting. He came with a demand. Hello, Brandon, I said, holding a mug of black coffee. I didn't invite him inside. The basement is locked because it contains items that do not belong to you. Everything in this house belongs to the family estate, he shouted, stepping closer. We have the moving truck scheduled for Saturday. I told you the bank needs the clean title. The bank needs a clean title, or the bank needs you to pay back the $50,000 you stole. The silence that followed was heavy. The anger on his face drained away, replaced by a sudden, ugly panic. He looked around the quiet suburban street, making sure the neighbors weren't listening. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but his eyes gave him away. "I went to the records office, Brandon. I saw the signature." I took a sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm bitter. "I haven't called anyone yet, but the moving truck is canceled. If I see a van on my driveway this Saturday, I will walk down to the local precinct with that file." He stared at me as if he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. For 30 years, I had been the woman who cooked his favorite meals and smoothed over his tantrums. I had never used a tone like this with him. "You're ruining my life over a loan," he hissed. "Vanessa's father invested $20,000 into this business based on my collateral. If this falls through, she'll leave me." "Then you should have married a woman who loved you, not your mother's house," I said, and closed the door. For the next 3 months, my phone was a graveyard. No texts, no Sunday visits, no checking in to see if I survived the January blizzard that dumped 2 feet of snow on Long Island. I learned from a mutual friend that Brandon and Vanessa had moved into a small, cramped apartment near the highway. They couldn't afford the lease on their luxury SUV anymore, so they traded it for an old sedan. Vanessa's father had pulled his investment after the franchise deal fell apart, and the blame was placed squarely on my shoulders. At the library, I buried myself in work. Some nights, the guilt was an ache in my chest. I would sit in my quiet living room, looking at his childhood photographs, wondering if I had been too harsh. A real mother is supposed to sacrifice right. That's what the book said. That's what society whispered. But then I would remember the forged signature. I would remember the senior apartment with the shuttle bus. They hadn't wanted to help me downsize. They wanted to erase me so they could live a life they hadn't earned. One evening, my neighbor, an elderly man named George, whose wife had passed 5 years prior, saw me shoveling the driveway alone. He walked over with his own shovel. "You look tired, Vivian," George said, clearing a patch of ice. "I am tired, George. Just wondering if being right is worth being lonely." George stopped and leaned on his shovel. "Lonely is when you're sitting in a room full of people who expect you to disappear. Right now, you're just alone. There's a difference." The ice melted and April arrived with soft rain. Out of nowhere, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was a formal invitation to Vanessa's 31st birthday dinner at an upscale seafood restaurant in Greenport. Inside was a short note in Brandon's messy handwriting. "Mom, we miss you. Let's put the past behind us. Dinner is on us. Please come." I held the card for a long time. Part of me wanted to believe the nightmare was over. I wanted to believe my son had grown up. But 20 years of motherhood teaches you how to read between the lines. They didn't have the money for a high-end restaurant in Greenport, not with their current financial situation. I decided to go. I didn't dress up to intimidate them. I wore my usual Sunday skirt and a simple cardigan. I brought a card with $50 inside a standard, modest mother's gift. When I arrived at the restaurant, the hostess led me to a private alcove in the back. Brandon and Vanessa were already there, along with Vanessa's parents, Richard and Helen. The table was covered in platters of oysters and expensive appetizers. Vanessa stood up and gave me a tight, perfumed hug. "Vivian, we are so glad you made it. Look at you, you look so peaceful." "Thank you, Vanessa. Happy birthday," I said, taking my seat. Brandon wouldn't meet my eye. He kept ordering drinks, his hands slightly trembling. Richard Vanessa's father was a loud man who wore a large gold watch. He spent the first 20 minutes talking about his golf game while Helen complained about the service. It felt like a performance, a stage play, where everyone knew their lines except me. "So, Vivian," Richard said, wiping his mouth with a cloth napkin as the main entrees were cleared. "Brandon tells me you're looking into diversifying your assets. Smart move at your age. The market is volatile." I set my fork down. The trap was finally opening. "I'm not sure what Brandon told you, Richard. My only asset is my home, and I have no intention of selling it." The smiles around the table froze. Vanessa's face tightened, her eyes darting to her husband. "Mom," Brandon said, his voice dropping an octave. "We talked about this. Richard has an opportunity in a commercial real estate venture. If we use the house as a guarantee, just a temporary cosign, we can clear my debt with the bank and get us all on track." "Your debt, Brandon, is a criminal matter that I chose not to pursue," I said clearly. The noise of the restaurant seemed to fade. "I came here tonight because I hoped you missed your mother. I see you just missed my signature." Helen gasped, looking at her daughter. Richard's face turned an angry shade of purple. "Listen here, lady," Richard growled, leaning across the table. "My daughter is living in a dump because of your stubbornness. We ordered a $300 dinner tonight to show you some goodwill, and you sit there acting like a martyr." "Then it's a good thing I brought my own way to pay," I said. I stood up, reached into my purse, and pulled out a $20 bill and the $50 gift card I had prepared. I placed them next to my plate. "That covers my salmon and my iced tea," I told Brandon. "The rest is up to you." "You can't just walk out on your son like this, Vivian," Vanessa shouted, her voice carrying across the restaurant. Several diners turned to look. "He's your only child. Who is going to take care of you when you're old? Who is going to come to your funeral?" I stopped at the edge of the alcove. I looked back at her, then at my son, who was staring at the table, utterly defeated. "If the price of having someone at my funeral is letting them destroy my life while I'm alive, Vanessa, then I'd rather have an empty room," I said. I walked out into the cool April night. The air smelled of salt and rain from the bay. My heart was pounding, but for the first time in years, my head felt clear. I didn't cry on the drive home. I didn't turn on the radio. I just listened to the steady sound of the tires on the asphalt. When I got home, I found a text from Brandon. "You embarrassed me in front of my in-laws. Don't ever call me again. You are dead to me." I stared at the screen. The words hurt, of course they did. But they didn't break me. I realized that the threat of losing him had been worse than the actual loss. He had been using his presence as a weapon against me for years, threatening to withdraw his affection if I didn't comply with his demands. Now that he had fired the gun, there was nothing left to fear. 2 months later, the consequences of their own choices caught up with them. Because I refused to sign the guarantee, Richard refused to bail Brandon out of his $50,000 bank debt. The bank, realizing the secondary signature on the equity loan was fraudulent, gave Brandon an ultimatum: pay the balance immediately or face legal collection. Brandon couldn't pay. To avoid public ruin, he had to liquidate his entire savings, sell his wedding ring, and take a second job working nights at a warehouse distribution center. Vanessa didn't stay long after that. She packed her bags and moved back into her parents' estate in the Hamptons, filing for a legal separation within weeks. She hadn't married a man. She had married a lifestyle, and when the lifestyle vanished, she did too. One Saturday morning, I was working the front desk at the library when Brandon walked in. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his clothes were wrinkled. He didn't look like the arrogant young man who had demanded my keys on Thanksgiving. He looked like a tired stranger. "Mom," he said, standing by the return slot. "Can we talk just 5 minutes?" I looked at the patrons browsing the shelves, then at the clock. "I'm on my break in 10 minutes, Brandon. You can wait outside on the bench." We sat on the wooden bench outside the library, watching the autumn leaves drift across the grass. He smelled like cheap coffee and stale cigarettes. "Vanessa left," he said, staring at his worn boots. "Her dad is helping her with the divorce. I'm living in a rooming house near the docks. I owe $30,000 more to the bank, and they're garnishing my wages." "I heard," I said simply. "I made a mistake, Mom." He whispered, a tear escaping his eye. "I was under so much pressure to be someone I wasn't. Vanessa always wanted more, and I thought if I got the house, I could fix everything and then pay you back before you ever noticed." I turned to look at him. I wanted to reach out and hold his hand, but I kept my hands folded in my lap. "You didn't just make a mistake, Brandon. You committed a crime against the one person who would have given you her last dollar if you had just been honest. You thought my love made me stupid." "I'm sorry," he sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "I'm so sorry, Mom. Can I just come home just for a few months until I get on my feet? I'll pay rent. I'll help around the house." I looked at the boy I raised, and then I looked at the house we were talking about. If I let him back in now, out of pity, the cycle would start all over again. He would become the victim, and I would become the caretaker. He needed to carry the weight of his own life for a while. "No, Brandon," I said softly but firmly. "You can't come home." He looked up, shocked. "You're turning me away when I'm at the bottom. You're at the bottom of a hole you dug yourself, son. If I pull you out now, you'll never learn how to climb." I stood up, smoothing my skirt. "I forgive you for the signature. I won't press charges, and I won't hold malice in my heart. But forgiveness is not the same thing as permission to use me again. I love you, but I love myself too." He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just sat there on the bench as I walked back inside the library to finish my shift. That was 6 months ago. Brandon is still working 2 jobs. He calls me once a month now. The conversations are short, awkward, and quiet. He doesn't ask for money anymore because he knows the answer. He asks about my garden, about the library, about my health. For the first time in his adult life, he is learning to listen. Sometimes I sit on my porch with a cup of tea and look at the empty driveway. The house is big, and some nights the silence is heavy. I made mistakes too. I spent years teaching him that my boundaries were flexible, and that was a disservice to both of us. True justice isn't about watching those who hurt you suffer in misery. It's about restoring the balance that was lost. By saying no to my son, I gave him the only gift he actually needed, the opportunity to become an honest man. And by choosing myself, I finally found the peace I had spent a lifetime giving away to everyone else.